I made this message for you. For you. You're gonna do great. You're gonna do great things. You're gonna do great.
What's up, guys? Welcome to Fiction Forge, the show that amps up your artistic arsenal.
We've got an awesome project for you today. It's a sort of seasonal occasion / fantasy themed mashup of sorts.
Well, we're so late with the seasonal part, I don't even know if we can call this an Easter video anymore. But the fantasy part is on point.
Yep, that was some tricky, time-consuming business. We were picking up the skills we needed while face-planting failure.
But in the end, we eventually came up with a one-piece silicone mold for making hollow dragon eggs from Game of Thrones. And we're going to show you how to do the same for yourself out of cheap, easy-to-find materials.
You know, I think Easter's image could do with a bit of an HBO edge.
Hell yeah. Halloween is always teasing it. Here are the materials we'll be using in this project. A bag of plaster of Paris and some balloons to form the base for our dragon egg. Some foam sheets to make the scales with, and some super glue to stick them to the egg. We are also using super glue quite ironically as a non-stick coating for the finished egg. We have chosen marine silicone to create the mold because it's food safe. And we're gonna need some dish soap to help us apply it to the egg. Some wood glue to create the texture on the bottom of the egg, and also to fill in the gaps in between the scales. A fair amount of chocolate will also be needed. Cooking chocolate will make it easier, but it doesn't taste too good. Chocolate coloring powders will work great to give the eggs their characteristic colors. A roll of masking tape and some cling wrap to stop the chocolate from leaking out while we cast it, and also to suspend the plaster egg while it sets.
And here are the tools we'll be using. A funnel to help pour the plaster with, and a bottle for mixing the plaster and pouring it into the balloon. A bowl to suspend the plaster egg in while it sets. A pen to trace out our scales, and a pair of scissors to cut them out. A blowtorch to help texture the bottom of the egg. A corking gun to make working with the silicone easier. A spoon to stir the chocolate while it melts. A double boiler and a heat source like a stove is needed to melt the chocolate. If you don't have a double boiler, try using one pot inside of another, or just use a microwave. Oh, and a fridge will also be useful to cool the chocolate while it sets.
First things first, in order to mold a dragon egg, one must first have a dragon egg. So in order to get an egg the right size and shape, we're going to use an awesome little technique involving plaster of Paris and balloons.
You can make these plaster eggs hollow like real eggs, but for our purposes a solid one is better, since we don't want to risk it getting broken while we stick the scales on.
To make a hollow one, you blow a balloon up to the size you want, and then you place it over the neck of a bottle with mixed plaster in it. You tip it in, tie it off, and slush it around until it dries, and voila, a big fake egg is born.
To make our solid one, first we fill a bowl with water and place 2 sheets of cling wrap over it, so that they're submerged but not touching the bottom. We can rest the egg on this while it sets, otherwise it will develop a flat side under its own weight.
We're doing this first because once we mix the plaster with water, it sets really quickly.
Now we measure out equal portions of plaster and water, then pour them into the jug.
Giving the bottle a good shake should mix the plaster thoroughly to make sure it pours smoothly. We can then go ahead and pop a balloon over the mouth of the bottle.
Turning the bottle upside down and giving it a squeeze will fill the balloon up with plaster. Leaving some plaster in the neck of the balloon while we tie it off will make sure there are no bubbles inside.
Giving the middle of the balloon a squeeze will lengthen it a bit, making it more egg-shaped. Now we can plop it down on top of the cling wrap while it sets so it won't get any finger marks.
Once it's solid, we can use a sharp blade to carefully cut away the balloon, revealing the egg inside. If it has any bumps, don't worry because they sand off really easily.
That's looking pretty excellent. Let's move on to the matter of the scales.
We're going to use a few different sizes of this teardrop shape for our scales, so we'll start making some templates. If you don't feel confident drawing them freehand, a good trick is to find a teardrop shape you like with a quick Google image search and then resize the image on screen until you're happy. You can now use a piece of paper to simply trace it straight off the monitor.
Once we've cut out our paper template, we can trace it onto some foam sheet. The first foam scale will be our actual template though. because it's easier to trace and it's more robust than paper.
It's also a good idea to mark the template so you can be sure to use the same one every time, preventing the proportions of our scales from changing.
If you look closely at the actual Game of Thrones eggs, you'll notice that the size of the scales descends towards the top. This means we're going to need several different sizes of our template.
To make these, we simply trim down a copy of our first template, mark it as number 2, then repeat the process till we have all the different sizes we need.
We made 3 main sizes as well as a few especially small sizes for the top. This egg had 16 rows of plus minus 17 scales, needing less per row towards the top. So yeah, you pretty much need a pile of them. Well, several piles, you don't want to get them mixed up.
Now before we go ahead and stick these on the egg, let's take a moment to create the texture on the bottom without fear of damaging the scales in the process.
A bit of wood glue and a blowtorch will create some convincing texture for the bottom, and a protective layer of super glue on top of that should stop it from sticking to the silicone.
If you're wondering how Mike can use his finger to spread it around like that without sticking, we aren't too sure either. This brand of super glue didn't seem to have the usual instant stick, so it worked well as a sort of enamel coating of sorts.
We found using an appropriately sized cup to help draw a reference line around the egg really helps with placing the scales neatly.
Now we're ready to begin carefully sticking our scales on with proper super glue until we've covered the entire surface of the egg.
Once we finish sticking them all on, we'll fill any gaps in between the scales with a bit of wood glue.
Once that's dry, we can go ahead and cover the entire thing in a protective coating of that wonky long work time super glue.
Now that we finally have a dragon egg, we can make a mold of it. To do this, we start by applying a thin layer of silicone to the whole egg, section by section without the aid of soap and water. So the silicone will grip tightly and not creep around on the surface.
Get that silicone down into all those crooks and nannies.
The reason we do it in small sections is to prevent accidentally smooshing parts you've already finished covering. Oh, and it also seems to help it cure faster.
Once the first layer is good to go, we can thicken it up and smooth it out using the soapy water technique, which is basically just using soap to stop the silicone from sticking to your hands. This mold made use of an entire 200ml tube of silicone.
Once the mold is set, we can cut it open and remove the egg inside. Cutting a zigzagged or wavy line will help the sides of the mold to line up again. This is what's known as mold registry.
Now we gotta let it air out a bit before we can mold chocolate with it because it stinks of vinegar. To help absorb some of the smell, let's cast a plaster egg with it.
We'll pour in some plaster, wrap it in cling wrap to catch the drips, and turn the egg until the plaster sets.
Then we carefully pop it open and oh, look at that, a beautiful white dragon egg. And it doesn't even smell anymore. I think we're ready to give this a try with some chocolate.
First, we'll try with some brown milk cooking chocolate because it's easier to work with than regular milk chocolate and white chocolate.
We're using a double boiler to help prevent the chocolate from overheating, which turns out is really easy to do and is really bad for your chocolate. It pretty much wrecks it.
So we recommend using a very low temperature. This stove goes from 1 to 10, and for our successful attempts we were at like a 3.
To try keep things from getting too messy, we set aside some cling wrap and tape to cover the mold with while it takes an ice bath to cool down.
The ice bath, however, turned out to be a big mistake. Water and chocolate do not mix. Get a drop of water in your chocolate and it'll become a lump of icing sugar mashed potatoes forever. And what's even worse is it'll infect and convert any other chocolate it comes into contact with.
We failed to cast a passable egg a bunch of times, but eventually we learned enough from our mistakes to get things right.
This time we ditched the ice bath and kept the heat as low as possible. We also allowed the chocolate to cool for a few minutes before we poured it into the mold, because inside the mold it is hella insulated. Some of the attempts we ended up turning the egg for over an hour and it still hadn't set.
This time, after a few minutes of turning the mold, the chocolate was set. Half an hour in the fridge should make sure it's as set as it's ever going to be.
Now we can pop it out the mold and there we go. That's what we're looking for. Just a tiny hole that we can fix with some extra chocolate, and we're ready to paint them up with some chocolate coloring powders.
In the show, the dragon eggs are bronze, green and red. Let's try achieve something similar with ours.
Some bronze with a bit of gold on the brown one is a good choice because the other colors don't really show up very well on it.
Now we can make one of our white chocolate eggs primarily green with some copper accents. And the other one will go with primarily red and purple accents. These are looking good. Like really good. I gotta say these look rather tempting.
Damn it, too tempting. Oh Tessie, how could you? That's a naughty girl. You're a very, very... who am I kidding? I can't stay mad at you.
And don't worry folks, she's all fine. It wasn't strong chocolate.
Hey, you still with us? Thanks a lot. Now please consider liking and subscribing. And hit that bell icon so you never have to miss out on any of the fun. A treat fit for a Targaryen.
Be honest, you kinda want one of these, don't you?
If you want one, you're gonna have to pay the iron price for it, because I'm sure the gold price will more than likely be accompanied by a cease and desist letter.
Maybe we can just call them Competition of Royalty, Drake Buttfruits.
Has a nice ring to it. Maybe we should get a few t-shirts made.